Hello and welcome to the School Safety Free Period. I'm Amanda Klinger,
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger.
and we're with the Educators School Safety Network. We are a national nonprofit organization, and we provide school safety training and technical assistance and professional development to educators throughout the country. And then every once in a while, we're a little bit less serious and a little bit less academic, and we get together here in our free period and talk about school safety, what teachers are experiencing across the country, and kind of what's happening and get the pulse of it. So, welcome.
So it's Happy New Year. It's the middle of the school year. So you're half done, teachers listening, and half to go. So it's a glass half full or half empty sort of situation potentially. But I think it might be a good time for us to take a quick look at what has been happening and what the status is of the fall of 2023 in the 23-24 school year. So, as some of you may know, we do conduct research on violent threats and incidents in schools. And every year we publish an annual report when there's not COVID. And we restarted last year with our report, the 22-23 school year, in case you're interested in seeing that. And then we typically try to do a mid-year report where we sort of take a look at how the year is shaping up compared to the same time period last year or compared to the totality of the 22-23 school year. So I thought today we might just take a look at like the number ones so far and see how it's shaking out when we compare one year to the previous.
And before you get too far into it, just for folks who haven't found the research, haven't read it yet, pull over in your car. You can head to the website www.eschoolsafety.org/violence. And the most recent report that Dr. Klinger mentioned, the 22-23, is there. The previous one before that, which unfortunately is before COVID, that was the previous year, 18-19, that's also there. So you can kind of get a sense of it longitudinally, and you can see all of the research. But don't read it while you're driving, or even if you're on the treadmill. I know people sometimes listen
Then you
to
have to stay pulled over.
yeah, you'll have to pull over, pause the treadmill, pull it up, and read it. You can probably read it on the treadmill, but don't read it while you're driving. So,
I think, yeah, you people, you'll figure it out.
well, I'm an
So,
attorney. I have to make sure I give those really important disclaimers.
oh,
So,
there you go. So we're not going to go through the whole thing because we'll kind of touch on different elements, perhaps here in the remaining podcasts in January as part of the mid-year. But I think probably the big takeaway that is probably not going to be a surprise to anyone is that 22-23 was a lot of swatting, a lot of issues, instances, implications, consequences, lots of stuff related to swatting was going on in the 22-23 school year. Amanda, do you want to recap what our findings up being about swatting for 22-23?
yeah, so overwhelmingly, it was by percentage and by number of incidents, the most frequent school based violent incident that schools faced. And just to kind of refresh everyone's memory, we categorize swatting as an incident because it necessitates a response from the school. Sort of the distinction between a threat and a swatting incident is a threat is I'm going to, right? Someone calls or emails in and says, I'm going to someday do this, or someday someone's going to do this. And a swatting is this is happening, right? It is an intentional false report. It is someone contacts the school or the non-emergency number or 911 and says this thing is happening, and it puts schools and responders and law enforcement into a response posture. An incident occurs. Now in swatting, we're thrilled to report that no one's injured because there actually isn't violence at school, but there's a period of time where people are in a response posture, and then importantly, students and teachers are impacted because they think that there is real imminent danger, and so we categorize those as incidents.
Because we call it what it is. It's an attack. It's an attack on a school. So in 22-23, that was about 63%, almost 64% of all the violent incidents that schools faced last year were swatting, false reports of violence that necessitated a response. This year to date, so that would be from August until the end of December of 23, that rate is only about 27%. So it is really down significantly than it was last year. That doesn't mean that, oh, good, swatting's over. It's no longer a thing.
Mhm.
But it does mean that while we know swatting is still occurring, it's not occurring at the rate that it was last year. And that could be for a variety of reasons that we can take a second to explore. But I do think it's interesting that while in schools that rate has come down, we've really seen kind of a recent rash of swatting things that are targeting politics. Politicians and state houses and different officials in the government that are being targeted. So the cynical side of me goes, well, maybe something will get done about swatting now if the politicians are being targeted. But it is interesting looking just from a school perspective that we have not seen it at the rate that we saw it last year. Any theories you want to float out there, Amanda, as to why?
I think it's like with everything else. We've been doing this research in one form or another since 2015, and these things just cluster, right? Bomb threats begat more bomb threats. Unspecified threats beget more unspecified threats. High profile school shootings, like the ones that you can name off the top of your head, beget more and more threats and more copycat shootings. I mean, these things cluster. And I think, there also is the potential that we've heard sort of unofficially from law enforcement that the school swatting incidents specifically, a lot of them were originating not from students, not from U.S. citizens, but from overseas. And I think it's possible that there was a lot of robocalls, which means I have one bad actor that is having this incredibly outsized impact and influence. I think it's possible that maybe some of those people were deterred or arrested or whatever the case may be.
Or
And
somehow they've been able to get out in front of it a little bit more to prevent it.
yeah, and I think it's interesting you mentioned about swatting happening in other arenas. It's feeling sort of anecdotally feeling like an uptick in swatting in other arenas. I think it's important to note that swatting is not like a school attack invention. Swatting is something that predated school
Yeah.
swatting as a phenomenon last year. Is something that sort of came to schools last year as a really emergent phenomenon. And then I think, I think it's one of those things that it's going to continue to happen until it stops working. And that the
Yeah, someone
question is,
tried it out in schools last year, and well, really at the end of, we began to see a
yeah.
little bit of it just before the pandemic. But you're right, someone sort of tried it out last year and found it to be fairly
Mhm,
successful and kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And
mhm.
now, for whatever reason, apparently it is less successful.
Yeah, one other thing that you mentioned about the rate of swatting in terms of a percentage of incidents being down. That's not to say that schools are not having incidents. I think sort of you can look at in the 2022-23 school year, if you just take the number of incidents and roughly divide it by half, saying about half of those occurred in the fall, that puts us at 349 incidents in the fall of 22. While in the fall of 23, we tracked 258 incidents. So it
Yeah,
is a decrease, but it's not like, oh, swatting stopped and then therefore schools had no incidents to respond to. It's
yeah,
just that the type of incidents now is a little bit more diffuse, as opposed to before it was an incredible quantity of swatting incidents and then a smattering of other things. Now you're seeing, 18% of our incidents in this fall were a gun being found on campus. You have 9% being shootings. You have 9% being outside violence impacting the school. You have 6% being fights that overwhelm the resources of the school and necessitate a response, and 6% being a suspicious person that necessitated a response. So it's not that schools didn't face incidents in fall of 23, it's just that they were facing a much wider array of types.
well, and I think that's probably one of the big takeaways is while we can go, oh, good, the rate of swatting
Right.
seems to be slowing. The problem or the inherent danger is that we as schools go, oh, good, it's slowing, so we don't have to worry as much about safety in general. when in reality, to your point, the slack, if you will, of the lack of swatting incidents is being picked up in other places.
Yeah.
So the schools are still responding to violent incidents at roughly the same pace that they were by December of 2022.
Mhm.
It's just that, like you said, it's more diffused. There's
Mhm.
more different, it is more evenly distributed across the different types, as opposed to sort of that outsized
Yeah.
attention and impact that swatting had in the 22-23 school year. In
And, you know,
terms of the threats, that's true also. We're about on pace in terms of the number of just pure threats. We're
mhm.
on pace from what it was last year as well. So I don't think we're going to see a significant decrease in any of these from, when we get to the end of 23-24. It's just maybe going to look differently in terms of what those incidents and threats were.
We're actually slightly above pace. If you take all of the threats from last year and if you just purely divide them in half between 2 semesters, that would have been 966 threats in the fall, and we had 1,004 this year so far in the fall. So yeah, we're exactly on pace. I wanted to say one other thing about incidents before we moved away from that into threats. And this is just because I always find this so fascinating. I'm a little bit removed from this research than what I used to be. We're tracking 2 detonations in the fall. Like, who here knew that there were 2 bombs successfully detonated in US schools in the fall? And again, they weren't catastrophic, or you would have heard of it. There wasn't significant loss of life, but someone brought an explosive device into 2 schools and successfully detonated it. We
Yeah.
also tracked one device that had a controlled detonation, and 8 times where someone thought there was a device and it necessitated a law enforcement response. And
Yeah.
it's, that's one of those things that it flies under the radar in terms of attention and media attention and the attention it takes up in our mind. And the concern that I have, and I feel like we talk about this a fair bit, if someone, a suspicious person, is walking around your school's parking lot with a long firearm, you're going to notice it, right? People are going to notice someone who's walking around brandishing a gun. A bomb is not legible to us in the same way. A bomb in a backpack is not noticeable to us in the same way, and has the potential to be as dangerous and as harmful. And so that's
Well, and
something to always just kind of make sure that we're haven't forgotten about.
if we follow that thread for just a moment, I think that bears some analysis, in the sense that, to your point, we've already had 2 detonations in the entirety of last year. We only had 3, so
Yeah.
we are already over what you would expect in
Yeah.
terms of, typically what we have seen. Also, in terms of the suspicious devices, it's a much higher pace
Mm-hmm.
than we would have expected. And then finally, pivoting us over into the threats, the rate of bomb threats is significantly higher this year to date than it was last year, in totality. And so, again, while we know that there is not a strong correlation between bomb threats equal actual bombs, it's more the inverse, where typically actual devices, there usually is oftentimes not a threat attached with them.
Mm-hmm.
It really speaks to this maybe underpreparedness on the part of schools for dealing with both sides of that coin,
Yeah.
in relationship to potential detonations, potential suspicious items, actual devices, and then the associated threat that goes with it, or that can be unrelated,
Yeah.
but is still a bomb threat. So I think it's, the big takeaway, I think, is that we always are going to be looking at these different types of threats and incidents that are not related to active shooter, but are still going to be significantly disruptive, and the potential to be significantly dangerous for kids.
So, what do you feel like in terms of recommendations for people getting back into the swing of things here for the spring semester?
Well, I think what both of these reports illustrate, 22-23 and 23-24 to date, what they both illustrate is, while clearly everyone is concerned about an active shooter situation in a school. What it really shows us is there are so many other things going on in schools, both in terms of threats and incidents
Mhm.
that are not related to the traditional stereotypical active shooter situation that is covered so extensively in the media. And I think anyone that's been in a school for 5 minutes realizes that there are always things going on there that don't have to do with a traditional active shooter sort of
Mhm.
situation, but are equally dangerous, disruptive, and potentially problematic. So I think the takeaway is what we always say the takeaway, which is we have to be looking at an all hazards approach to
Mhm.
safety.
Yeah. I think last year in the wake of all of the swatting incidents, I think our big recommendation and takeaway was that sort of doing the work ahead of time, doing that pre-work to set yourself up for success, to be able to have a response that you can dial up really quickly when we believe there's an active shooter, and then scale back really quickly when we find out that we're not. I think you can take that advice, even in the absence of that large looming presence of swatting, and
Mhm.
that notion of doing the pre-work to be prepared to be nimble. I think to be nimble in terms of what you mentioned, all of the different types of risks and hazards and the different types of threats and incidents that schools are facing, that doing the work to set yourself up to be nimble, to respond to a different type of thing, as opposed to we've done so much work, sort of like, oh, I'm gonna go real in the weeds here with an analogy. Like when you see like people who are like so hardcore into weightlifting that they only do like the same movements over and over again, and they're like super bulky because they're doing those like real specific movements, like so strong, but yet like if you ask them like, can you twist and do this, and like can you whatever, and you can't, because right, you've worked these so only muscles, specific muscles, so hard that you
You've
can't,
bound yourself.
that you've constrained yourself. And so I think, to take the analogy, I don't know what that would mean. We need to do the yoga of school safety, that you can be nimble, and that you have lots of different muscles built up, and you have lots of different skills and capabilities in terms of response, in
Well,
terms of communication, that you
well,
can
and
be
this is not
really
a
nimble.
it's not a great analogy, but I guess if we're going to go down your analogy, we're advocating for much more of a cross training
Yes.
approach
Functional cross training. Yes.
where you have capabilities to
Yep.
respond to an active shooter to lift the weight, but you also have the capabilities to do the things that are everyday, like walking, bending,
Hmm.
flexing, those kind of things.
Yeah.
You have the capability to do those things that are much more everyday in a school, which is a bomb threat, a regular threat, a fight, a medical emergency,
Outside violence spilling into the
yeah,
school.
all of the different
Yeah.
things that happen at a significantly higher rate than the horrific active shooter event.
Yeah.
And so I think that we find year after year after year as we look at this data that that's exactly been the case over time since we've been doing this,
Yeah.
what, 2013, 2014.
Yeah.
Over time, you see the same things that schools are facing a diverse array of both threats and incidents,
Hmm.
which will not be adequately addressed by just doing our annual active shooter training and calling it a day.
Yeah. And also, I'm sorry to all the gym bros. Please, you lift weights how you want to lift weights, man. That's that's great.
Is there a strong advocacy for on the part of
I,
muscle people or
I don't
something?
know, but I don't want to yuck someone's yum. We're just trying to encourage people to prepare for school safety in a real broad way. So the analogy,
There you
it
go.
has limitations.
There you go. But
So,
I do think it's important, periodically throughout the school year to kind of take that pause, whether you're an administrator or a teacher or whatever your role is in the
hmm,
school, to take that pause and go, wow, we've been thinking a lot about X.
sure.
Have we given any consideration to Y and Z? And the data and the research that we do indicates that school safety issues are not just about X, whatever your X might be,
Hmm.
that they are a whole alphabet of different issues, which may seem very overwhelming, but I think in reality, it really should be somewhat comforting that while there's this whole array, there are these fundamental foundational skills and preparedness that we can do that will help us to be prepared for this wide array. Because out there on the horizon is some other means or threat or some other way to disrupt schools that we are not yet aware of.
Yeah.
But we'll be able to adapt and deal with those if we have a lot of tools in the toolbox instead of just a hammer.
Well, I
Just
think that's
mixing our analogies. But
so many analogies. I love it.
next time we'll try another one.
All right. Well, I think we'll probably leave it there. You can, like I said, find the research on our website, eschoolsafety.org/violence. You can find lots of other free resources and information there, eschoolsafety.org. You can always reach out to us with questions that you have. We have a lot more interesting discussions coming forward for the spring 24. And until next time, thanks so much.